Welcome back to Shiurim and Piyyut. We are now up to Piyyut number 4, which is after the Piyyutim that fit with the first 3 Barachot of the Amidah. That is, the first Piyyut fits in and is part of the first Piyyut of the Amidah and concludes with the Hatimah of that Baracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avraham. The second Piyyut, the Mahayeh, is part of and concludes with the Hatimah of the second Baracha of the Amidah, Baruch Atah Hashem Mahayeh Ametim. And the third one, the Mishalesh, it starts the third Baracha. It does not conclude with the Hatimah of that Baracha because we're still in that Baracha. But the subsequent Piyyutim, which are all going to be inside the third Baracha, thus don't relate directly to a Baracha of the Amidah. They are harhavot, expansions within the third Baracha. So here we are. Uyamti b'chil Kippur. It's the Kedushta for the first day of Sukkot that we've been reading all along by Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Kallir or Kallir. And we're at Piyyut 4, Ad lo mitzuke regev. Piyyut 4 comes after the words El na, which we saw at the end of the string of verses after the Mishalesh. We saw them there as the conclusion of the verses of the Mishalesh, but in many manuscripts, these words introduce Piyyut 4 rather than closing the verse chain after Piyyut 3. You see here in the tripartite machzor, it's a machzor that we've seen various times so far in the Shiurim. So you see at the beginning, the words El na, they introduce this Piyyut. And then the closing words you see on the last line, the last 2 words of the penultimate line, Chai v'kayam. And then the bottom, Nora umarom v'kadosh, living and enduring one, awesome and lofty and holy. Here in the Worms machzor, on the other hand, you see the last 2 lines here of the verse chain after the Piyyut 3, after the Mishalesh. Yimloch Hashem lo, v'ne'amar Yimloch Hashem lo olam, vav nun is v'ne'amar, and then v'ata kadosh, Yoshev Tilot Yisrael, and immediately after that, El na, with those words going with the verse chain. And the scribe here has made the first words of the Piyyut proper, Ad lo mitzuke regev, very large. And then the last words, those concluding words, Chai v'kayam, living and enduring one, Nora umarom v'kadosh, awesome and lofty and holy. You can see the scribe has written those in red, rubrication. So here is Piyyut 4 in this Kedushta. Now, if you look at it, you're already going to see it's very different from the Piyyutim that we've seen already. How is it different? Well, does it have stanzas? Remember, in the previous ones, we saw 4-line stanzas, and we used to look at one stanza per slide, and we would analyze it. I put a space in the middle because you see that the lines in the second half are shorter, but there are certainly not discrete stanzas, or if they are, they're very big. And if you look in other Piyyutei Dalet, Piyyutim of this 4th position, they certainly are not of any kind of comparable size to each other, nor are there always 2. There's often just one, often one rhyme all the way through and the same. And so is this poetry? What's going on here? So it's non-strophic. That means there are not strophes. There are not stanzas. There's no acrostic. It's often just rhyming prose or even non-rhyming prose. So what does categorize it? Poetry is all about regularity. What's the regularity here? So we saw the words El na at the beginning, which might go after the verse chain after Piyyut 3, and we saw at the end it always ends with the word kadosh, usually in one of the following formulations: marom v'kadosh, nora umarom v'kadosh, chai v'kayam nora umarom v'kadosh. What does this sound like? Sounds like a kind of introduction to Kedusha. The Holy One going into holy, holy, holy. But we're only at Piyyut 4. Kedusha is going to be only after Piyyut 8. What's going on here? I'll mention just as an aside that it was common in many Ashkenazic synagogues that when the Chazan would conclude this Piyyut, the congregation would respond by praying very loudly, screaming out, Chai v'kayam nora umarom v'kadosh, living and enduring one, awesome and lofty and holy, to such that the expression Shrayen Chai v'kayam in Yiddish, to shout Chai v'kayam, becomes an expression for to shout very loudly, and often with changed meaning, to shout, to protest something, which is certainly not what's going on here. So in our Piyyut, look, is it non-strophic? It's non-strophic. Is there any acrostic? Ayin, vav, vav, mem, vav, kap. Nope, no acrostic. Is there rhyme? Sukko, sikucho, sukko, sikucho, sikucho, lesakacho, vinisko, lechasacho. Yes, yes, there's rhyme. Every word, it ends in the syllable ko and also has the consonant s before it. And in the majority of the lines, it's from the root samach kaf kaf, to cover over, which is the root of the words sechach, the covering of the sukkah, and the words sukkah and the word sukkah itself. But in the second half, instead of rhyme, we have these pairs, which again might look like rhyme to an English reader because everything ends in the vowel o. But in Hebrew, that's not enough for a rhyme. A rhyme, you need to rhyme the whole syllable. So ko and bo and no don't rhyme. So then why do they all have this vav at the end? Because that's simply that is a possessive suffix in Hebrew. His sukkah facing his sukkah, his place of lying, his couch facing his place of lying, his cloud facing his cloud, simply a grammatical suffix. So we don't have rhyme in the second half. The rhyme ends. But instead, we've got these pairs of words, sukko, sukko, bisibo, bisibo, anano, mul, anano. What's going on here? So we have to go back to the book. Shulamit Alitzor's Sod Mishalashei Kodesh, the Kedushta, from its origins until the time of Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Kallir, which we looked at already in at least one of our previous shiurim in this series. She does on page 170. Ach lama davka proza machorezet yafa lahavir likdusha, lakedusha. But why is rhyme prose specifically good for introducing the kedusha? I need to step back here first. Well, include something that I did not include as a slide, but I will explain from that same chapter, the 4th chapter in that book, where her argument is effectively that in an earlier period, in the prehistory of the Kedushta, of this whole structure, before the time of our poet, Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Kallir, and even before the time of Yanai, an earlier poet, who was an important influence on the early poetry of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Kallir, that in earlier times, the Kedushta had the first 3 components, the Magen Machaya Mishalesh. Mishalesh is, of course, the beginning of the 3rd bracha. And then after that component, it had a short prose passage leading into the Kedusha, such that there were a total of 4 passages in the Kedushta, the 3 Piyyutim, and then after the verse chain of the 3rd one, there was a short fixed prose passage. We're not going to read that prose passage now. It was the same in every Kedushta, but it's moved to a later position. We will look at it after shiur number 5. And she argues that in an early period, that after the earliest period, that for that fixed prose passage was replaced with a prose passage that each poet would write anew for each Kedushta, rhymed prose or unrhymed prose. And then that would lead directly into the Kedusha, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And then in a further stage, the Kedushta grew even more to several piyutim beyond that, such that instead of having the Kedusha after the Kedusha comes straight after Piyyut 4, it comes after Piyyut 8. But in the meantime, the structure was fixed of Piyyut 4. So if originally this led to the Kedusha, why rhyming prose? So Professor Elitzur writes about Yanai, an earlier poet, who takes advantage of the relative freedom allowed to him in this part of the Kedushta. Rhyming prose, there's structure to it, but it's not fixed the way we had with the stanzas, fixed number of stressed words in each stanza, fixed number of lines in each stanza. So he constructs them in such a way that the rhythms become progressively quicker as they reach the conclusion, kadosh, at the end. The piyyut generally begins with calm pairs of lines of 4 beats each. But as he progresses, the pace quickens and the lines are only of 2 beats. And at the same time, the rhymes are more frequent, because if you have lines that are 2 beats, they're shorter, and therefore, if they're rhyming, the rhymes are going to be every other word rather than every 4th word. The closer Yanai gets to the end of this part, the more he makes use of a number of devices that create a ככל שינאי מתקרב אל סיום הקטעים הוא נוקט בשלל תחבולות היוצרות ציפוף צלילי גדל והולך, לעתים עד כדי יצירת אפקט אקסטטי. The more he makes use of a number of devices that create a progressively more crowded rumble of sound, sometimes even to the point of creating an ecstatic effect, so that the only place you can get to that is Nora Marom B'Kadosh. Now, we don't exactly have that here. We don't have lines getting, the lines don't get to the point of 2 stressed words, unless you don't want to stress the word mul, in which case you just have Sukkot, mul Sukkot, misibo, mul misibo. But even if you do stress mul, Sukkot, mul Sukkot, misibo, mul misibo, is certainly much quicker than the earlier lines, which as you see are much longer here. And there is this effect that when they're very simple, they're not sentences, it's this very simple God's sukkah facing God's sukkah, God's riding place facing God's riding place, God's throne facing God's throne, and it will all lead to the Chai v'Kayam, living and enduring one, the awesome and lofty and holy one. Anyway, enough about structure. What's the content of this piyyut? Do you remember this from the previous piyyut? We talked about how the first 2 piyyutim didn't really talk about sukkah at all. They talked about lulav. The third one talked about sukkah, but it was not the literal sukkah. Rather, it was the clouds of the kavod. We spent a lot of time introducing that and all the biblical verses related to it in our shiur on piyyut number 3. Here, too, we're going to have a non-literal sukkah. But this time, the sukkah doesn't equal the clouds of glory. This time, the sukkah equals the temple. But there are 2 temples. There's God's heavenly temple on high, and there's the temple in Jerusalem. We saw this verse already in the 3rd shiur. Vayhi v'shalem sukkah u'ma'onato v'tzion. His sukkah was in Salem, Jerusalem, and his lair in Zion. Let's look at this midrash from Midrash Tehillim 76:3. Vayhi v'shalem sukkah u'ma'onato v'tzion. Amar Rabbi Berechia. Rabbi Berechia said, Mitechilat biryato shel olam asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Yerushalayim sukkah. From the beginning of the creation of the universe, God made a sukkah in Jerusalem. Was there a Jerusalem then? The beginning of the creation of the universe? Was there a pre-existent Jerusalem, the place of the Mikdash? Can't have been a physical place because there was no physical world. But the concept of Jerusalem and this metaphysical Jerusalem, God made a sukkah in Jerusalem, and as it were, Kivyachol, sheyavit palel b'tocha. Wow, God is praying inside this sukkah, this metaphysical sukkah in this metaphysical Jerusalem. What's he praying? May it be the will. God can't say, may it be your will. So God says, may it be the will, may it be a will, that my children will carry out my will, so that I will not destroy my house my temple, which had not yet been built. So God is sitting praying in the sukkah that his children will be good and that he won't have to destroy his temple once he's destroyed it. But when their sin brought it about, what is written? He violently trashed what? He trashed his sukkah like a garden and destroyed his meeting place. Calls the temple his sukkah. His meeting place, the place where he himself used to meet in prayer. And now that it's been destroyed, he prays, may it be my will that my children perform teshuvah, that they repent, so that I may hasten the building of my house and my temple. Great. So this is a prayer, God's prayer before the temple was built, and presumably all the days of the temple, is may the temple not be destroyed. And after the time of the temple, God's prayer is may my children do teshuvah so that I may rebuild it. But there's another version of this. I have not been able to find a synopsis or critical edition of Midrash Tehillim. Their work has been done on synopses, that is, presentations of all the various manuscripts of a text side by side. Work has been done for Midrash Tehillim up to, I think, Psalm 72. Unfortunately, this is Psalm 76, so we don't have it. But I know from manuscript commentaries on this very Piyyut that there's another version of this text. Rabbi Brechia b'shem Rabbi Chalba Omer. Rabbi Brechia said in the name of Rabbi Chalba, right? It's the same Rabbi Brechia from Midrash Tehillim. It's the parallel to the text. Ad shuhu shalem, when it was not yet, when there was not yet Salem. Ad shuhu shalem. Here in the manuscript on the side, Ad shuhu shalem, I transcribed it. Asah kodesh, kadosh, sukkah. God made a sukkah. Vayamit palel betocha. And he would pray inside. His sukkah was in Salem and his lair in Zion. And what was his prayer? May it be the will that I see the construction of my house. It's not about the far future when he's worried that the Bnei Yisrael will sin and the temple will be destroyed, or after that it be rebuilt. But it seems to me that God's sitting there in this sukkah before the creation of the world and praying for the initial building of the temple. Let me get there. Let me get to that time that the actual temple can be built, not just this sukkah. We see this same version of the Midrash in the margin here of the tripartite machzor. Right here where the cursor is. Rabbi Brechia b'shem Rabbi Chalba Amar ad shuhu shalem asa kadosh sukkah, right? Vayamit palel b'tocha. Here, ma hayamit palel yehi ratzon sher'eh bimhera binyan beiti. May it be the will that I soon see the building, the construction of my house. And here in Budapest Kaufman A400, which is it's a manuscript just of commentaries of Piyutim without the actual text of the Machzor in it, just the commentaries. Again, we see it as the Midrash, the way the other Piyyut commentaries express it. Look at the last line, the last two lines of Mahaytat Filato. What was his prayer? Yiratzon sher'eh be. It says B'tzion beiti. It may be my will that I see Zion, my house, but Tzion is probably a textual corruption of B'vinyan. It's easy for the letters for Bet Nun to become a tzadi in careless copy in copying. Okay. There's a new book that came out in 2023, Yoshua Granat. This was his PhD dissertation, which he wrote years ago. I read it when it was his dissertation. It is now a book, Azmi Lifnei Breshit, then long ago, before creation. The things that pre-existed creation, according to early Piyutim. And one of them is the place of the temple, the name of the Messiah, the phenomenon of teshuvah, repentance, the throne of God's throne of glory. It's a number of things. There's this list. here we're talking about this pre-existent sukkah, which is it's the concept of the place of the mikdash before and before creation existing. Okay, now let's see a second midrash. This is also in the name of Rabbi Brechia. Same Rabbi Brechia, presumably we saw before. This is preserved in Exodus Rabbah, Shemot Rabbah 33:4 on the parasha V'yik Holi Teruma, which is this week's parasha, which we're going to read tomorrow. It's about the construction of a mishkan, construction of a tabernacle. So this talks about construction of the temple. Now, the dating of this part of Exodus Rabbah is a midrash that contains two parts. The first half, which is definitely later, and the second half, which is of the Tanhuma genre, which had started already a little before the time of Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Kallir, but works in the Tanhuma genre were mostly written after his time. We don't know exactly when to date it, but whatever, this tradition is dated in the name of Rabbi Berechia, who lived, I think, in the 4th century CE. So even if the text is much later, it's quoting something in the name of a much earlier rabbi. Rabbi Berechia batach lecha shema gedula v'gevura kichol b'shamayim v'aretz. Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power. Kichol b'shamayim v'aretz, for everything in heaven and earth. What's heaven and earth? What's it doing here? Atamot kol ma'aseh bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'ma'alan bara l'matan. Everything that God created on high in heaven, He created also down below. L'ma'alan zavul v'arafel. High, there's a zavul, a dwelling, a temple. V'arafel, and thick cloud. Was a word we had in last week's parasha, when Moses ascended into the thick cloud where God was, right? That's the thick cloud up in heaven. As it is said, look down, look from thy holy zivul. And Arafel, the thick cloud, the verse I just quoted from last week's parasha, Moses approached the heavenly cloud. Down below, when King Solomon was dedicating the temple, As Amar Shlomo Adonai Amar Lishka Barafel. Solomon then said, the Lord said that He would dwell in the thick cloud of smoke in the temple. Uchtiv, and it is written, Vano vaniti beit zavul lach. I built a home, a zavul for thee. So you have Arafel, thick cloud, and zavul, above and below. Above, there is the throne of God, Kisei Hashem, Lamalan Kisei Hashem. Lamatan, down below, Kisei Chavod Marom, Meiri Shaon, Mekam, Mikdashenu, throne of the Kavod, lofty from long ago, the place of our temple. And this midrash goes through all sorts of other parallels above and below the heavenly temple and the earthly temple. They did not fit on this slide, and we don't need to read it all now. It gets somewhat tedious because it keeps going through and says above there's this, below there's this, here's a verse for this, here's a verse to show this. And now we're ready to look at the Piyyut. And again, you see it's the structure of it. It does not have these discrete stanzas. It's not strophic. And there was not yet the foundation, when there were not yet the foundations of earth from Shetiah of his sukkah. And there had not yet been any stretching of the tent of his sikuch, his covering, again, sukkah, the heavens. Ever since then, through now, his sukkah has been in Salem. As we saw, his sukkah from the beginning of creation, and then that becomes his temple. And even without a temple, God has this sukkah where He enters and prays for the rebuilding of the temple. Yearning and hoping. All this from the beginning of creation. And just as He set His heavenly hiding place around Him with its covering, so did He command His beloved people down below to cover Him with a screen. And there to constantly provide His grain offering and wine libation. For everything is in heaven and earth, He said, leaving out nothing. But Sukkot mul Sukkot, Misibo mul Misibo, Anano mul Anano, Shichno mul Shichno, is Sukkah opposite is Sukkah, is couch opposite is couch, is cloud opposite is cloud. His residence opposite his residence, machono mul machono, ma'ono mul ma'ono, his den opposite his den, his lair opposite his lair, rechuvo mul rechuvo, kis'o mul kis'o, besukat chai v'kayam, norau marom v'kadosh, his chariot opposite his chariot. His throne opposite his throne in the sukkah, the living and enduring one, awesome and lofty and holy. Okay, let's analyze that. Ad lo mitzukei regev shitiyah at sukkah, when there are not the foundations of earth from shitiyah v'sukkah. Foundations of earth, mitzukei regev. This phrase the poet constructed by putting together two different verses. One is from Hannah's prayer, the prayer of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, in the beginning of the book of Samuel. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. And he set the land upon them. Tzuke, the foundations, the cast, like cast metal, like cast iron, but cast metal foundations of the land. And the other is bitzeket afar lamutsak urgavim yilubako, when the dust runs into a mass and the clods cleave fast together. So the clods are clods of earth, clods being here used therefore as a metonymy, a word standing for a related word for the earth itself. So mitzukei regev are the mitzukim, the foundations of the regev, singular of regavim, of the earth. Note also that that same root, or a related root rather, in mitzukei, from the root suk, and mutsak from the related root yatsak. Those that are, one is the cast foundations, the molten foundations. The other talks about everything running into a molten mass when dust all mushes together. So mitzukei regev also echoes the words urgavim in that second verse alone, but it only makes sense with the conflation of that with the first verse, mitzukei eretz. And there had not yet been, terem means when there's not yet, according to Rashi in Parashat Va'era. It's true, Ibn Ezra disagrees. He says it means before, but Rashi says it's not so much before there was, it's when there was not yet. Before implies there's going to be. When there was not yet is there wasn't. God had not stretched out the tent of his covering, his sikuch, his chach, his sukkah. So the verse in Isaiah, that should be 52. No, it's 40. It's in chapter 40. 5:2 is just wrong. It's somewhere in chapter 40. God spread out the heavens like something very thin and stretched them out like a tent to be inhabited. So the stretching out of the tent of God's covering is when God stretched out the heavens. So it's before God set out the earth and before God set the heavens. I seem to be missing here. There's a whole passage in the Babylonian Talmud on this word shitiyah, Palestinian Talmud, in both of the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. I don't seem to have it here on this PowerPoint. So I'll say, what is the foundation from shitiyah of his sukkah? So there's a Mishnah in Masechet Yoma about the temple service on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur, where the high priest, he has to enter in and sprinkle the sacrificial blood, sprinkle it at the place of the ark. And the second number, when there was no ark, there was still, though, a stone where the ark had stood, and that stone was called shtiyah, foundation stone. And in the Talmud there, it says that it was called so because mimenu nishtat ha'olam. From there, the world was founded. The world was founded from the place of the temple and spread out to all directions. And in fact, it quotes there in the Talmud, it quotes this verse from Job, Betzeket afar lamutsak, urgavim yedubaku. So the place of shitiyah, it's the place central in the temple, the Holy of Holies, this rock there, but it is also, it's the place from which all creation, all the universe spread out. This fits very much with the themes of this Piyyut in general, which is that even before creation, God had this Sukkah, and the Sukkah is this metaphysical Jerusalem, which becomes the physical Jerusalem. So Shitiyah, from which the whole world was established, it comes out of this place. The Shitiyah Sukkot, the Shitiyah of his Sukkah in the place of the temple before there even was such a thing as place or time. Ever since then, through now, his Sukkah has been in Salem. Again, we saw that verse, Psalm 76:3. He was yearning and hoping, when will it be covered over? And although this is talking about way before creation and all the times of creation until the building of the temple, of course, this has poignancy for the poet and for us living in a time when there is no temple, when the temple was destroyed. Just as God was praying before the existence of the temple, when he just does a sukkah, may I see the building of my temple. So too, we who dwell in the sukkah, not in the metaphysical sukkah, but in the very physical sukkot around our houses and above our houses, in our courtyards and roofs and all around, yearning for when will there be the covering over such that there'll be the true temple. Now we go to the themes of that second midrash about everything that's on high is down below. And just as he set his heavenly hiding place around him with its covering. What's that? It's a very cryptic verse in Psalms. Yashet choshech sitro svivotav sukkata hashchat mayim avei shechakim. He said darkness as his hiding place, sitro. Sivivotav sukkato, with his sukkah around him. The idea that this darkness is this booth, this hut around him. Heshchat mayim, darkness of water, thick clouds, where the rain from there comes from there and goes down to earth. Cain, so tzav yedidav, did he command his beloved people, yedidim, his friends, his beloveds, betachat, down below, masach l'sakkacho, to cover him with a screen. That's a verse in it's in Parashat Pekudei. Vayavet Aaron el Mishkan vayasem et parochet hamasach vayasech al Aaron ha'idut kasher tziva Adonai Moshe. He brought the ark to the Mishkan and he set up the screen curtain, parochet hamasach, the screen, the curtain, to cover the covering curtain, masach also apparently being from that root of sukkah, to cover the ark of the testimony as the Lord had commanded Moses. Just as there is this dark cloud covering, which is sukkot above, surrounding God's presence, so the place of God's presence down below is in the Holy of Holies. And there too, covering that is the parochet hamasach, the covering curtain. And in that place, the broader building and whole construction, where courtyard, where all complex, where all that is, namely the temple, there to constantly provide his grain offering and wine libation. Why mention specifically here the wine libation? Because you can rhyme nisko with all the others. It's got the samach and the ko, the kaf. It's not from the same root, but it does rhyme with them. Ki chol b'shamayim va'aretz, for everything's in heaven and earth, he said. Patz, this is a Paitanic word for to speak. Patza means to open. And as we saw in Paitanic Hebrew, with the three letter roots getting contracted to two letters, so patza becomes patz, fine. And to open his mouth. He opened his mouth. He said, leaving out nothing. So this shows you, yes, just as we talked about, these three letter roots becoming two letters. Sa becomes nasa. Similarly, tav from tiva and patz from patza. Now we have the various things that exist above and below. Sukkot mul sukkot. His sukkah, opposite is sukkah, right? God has a sukkah in heaven. As we saw where the rain, which surrounds him and brings down the rain, opposite is sukkah. Like Shalem sukkot, he's got a sukkah on earth. Mitzibo mul mitzibo, his couch opposite his couch. Ad shamelech bimsibo, when the king was on his couch, Shir Shirim Rabbah, in the Song of Songs Rabbah, it said, Ad shemelech malchem lachim bimsibo barakia, when he's on his couch in heaven. But if he has a couch in heaven, where he dwells on earth in his temple, that's also his couch. I've not found any explicit reference in rabbinic literature to the temple as his couch, the temple on earth as his couch. But if there's a temple, except this Piyyut, right? If there's a temple, if there's a couch on heaven, then the temple is his couch on earth. Anano mul anano, shichno mul shichno. We saw anano mul anano as cloud, opposite this cloud. We saw that in Exodus Rabbah earlier, with the arafel, with the thick cloud in heaven, the thick cloud in the temple. Shichno mul shichno is residence, opposite is resonance, right? The heaven is called God's residence, and the temple, Mishkan, is the place where God is. Shin kafnun shachin, resides. Mechono mul mechono is den, opposite is den. His lair opposite his lair. Ma'on and machon are names of two of the heavens. We see this both in literature in Bavel, the Babylonian Talmud Hagiga 12b, and in literature in Eretz Israel, Leviticus Rabbah 29:11. The seven heavens are Vilon, Rakia, Shahakim, Zvul, Ma'on, Machon, and Aravot. Okay, is there Ma'on and Machon on earth? Yes. Where? In the temple. When Solomon dedicated the temple, he says, Bano baniti beit Zvul lach. Machon l'shivtecha olamim. I built a home, a zavul for thee. We saw this verse. A den, a machon for thee to dwell forever. What about a ma'on, a lair? Yes. In Psalms, Adonai ahavti ma'on beitecha u'makom mishkan kevodecha. O Lord, I love the lair of thy house and the place of dwelling for thy kavod. So names of the two heavens we have also as names of the temple. So his throne opposite his throne, we know God's throne is in heaven, and we saw the throne on earth, we saw in the verse in Jeremiah, Kisei Chavod Marom Rishon Mekom Mikdashenu, the place of our temple, he calls Kisei Chavod, throne of the Kavod, the throne of glory. What about his chariot, his place of riding? Well, we have a verse in Deuteronomy, Ein Ka'el Yishurun Rochev Shamayim Be'ezrecha Uvga'avata O Shachakiim. There's none like God, O Jeshurun, O people of Israel, who rides the heavens to help thee, and the skies in his excellency. God rides through the heavens. So God's got a chariot in heaven. What about on earth? Well, this is describing the Holy of Holies, the place of the Aron, Ultavit, Hamerkava, Akeruvim, Zahav, Leforesim, Vesochachim, Al Aron, Berit Adonai, and for the construction of the Merkava, the chariot, the cherubim, gold to spread out and cover the ark of testimony of the Lord, that the Aron with its Keruvim, with its cherubim, is what, with their wings, is what God rides upon. Incidentally, we generally refer to Ezekiel's vision of the chariot in Ezekiel chapter 1 as the vision of the chariot, Maaseh HaMerkava, the episode of the chariot. But the word Merkava never appears there. We see this thing that's flying with wheels. Why do we call it a Merkava? Well, it does have wheels. But also the word seems to be taken because that is the heavenly component of what we see on earth in the Holy of Holies, which is called Merkava in this verse in Chronicles. Kis'o mul kis'o, is thrown opposite his throne. We see the lines getting short and to the point until and creating that feeling, maybe not quite ecstatic, but moving towards the Kedushta for the congregation or son. V'sukas chai v'kayom nora umarom v'kadosh, in the sukkah of the living and enduring one, awesome, lofty, and holy. Here you see this the words Chai v'Kayam again in red. And just a moment, this media player crashed, but let's open it again. I will play you some sound. Here. Let me share that new window, screen sharing. Sorry about that. I had it all open, but that program crashed. Screen share. Here we have this. And here, share sound.
Mechono mul mechono, maono mul maono, mesibo mul mesibo, rechova mul rechova, kiso mul kiso, besukas chai v'kayam.
So that is the nusach, the traditional chant formula for the last lines of Piyyut Daled, the fourth Piyyut in any Kedushta. As I've received the tradition and as I hear it regularly in my synagogue in Kahal Shura and in Washington Heights in New York. I want to say briefly that this piyyut that we just looked at, while it was preserved in the Western Ashkenazic rite, and therefore I am familiar with it from the above mentioned synagogue, Kahal Shura, which follows that rite, this piyyut disappeared quite early from the Eastern European rite, which is the tradition of most Ashkenazic synagogues today, even though at this point most of them don't recite a Kedushta. Some of them do, and those that do not recite this particular piyyut. In other Kedushta, they will definitely recite piyyut 4, but in this Kedushta, it fell out. I'm not going to discuss right here the possible historical reasons for that, because that will be relevant in the next shiur. It's connected with the next piyyut. But it does mean you will not find this piyyut in Art Scroll. You will not find this piyyut in the Matei Levi Machzorim. You will not find this piyyut in the Kobo Machzorim. You will not find this in the typical Ashkenazic Machzorim, because typical Ashkenazic Machzorim that are sold today tend to be Eastern Ashkenazic. You'll need to find it in a Western Ashkenazic Machzor. It is, of course, still published in the Western Ashkenazic Machzorim because it's still recited in those synagogues. You will find it. The Rodelheim Machzorim, those are the primary ones where you'll find it. And, of course, you will find it in Daniel Goldschmidt's scientific critical edition of Machzor Sukkot, because he's trying to include everything from the tradition. Well, here we are at the end of Piyyut 4. And I wish you a good Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.